American Phoenix. It's a story of disaster and survival. But not, as you might think, survival in terms of how to survive a disaster, but in terms of how to rebuild your life after losing everything. Now, we've all had these moments in our lives where the ground is ripped out from underneath us. Everything changes in an instant. Nothing is as it was. Nothing will be the same. These moments test us. They challenge our instincts, our loyalties, our faith in ourselves, our emotions, and they certainly challenge our courage. On May 16th, 1874, the Williamsburg Reservoir Dam in western Massachusetts gave way. It unleashed an inland tidal wave that was 20 to 40 feet high and 300 feet wide. 600 million gallons of water roared down the Mill River Valley through the villages of Williamsburg, Skinnerville, Haydenville, Leeds, Florence, and the town of Northampton. To give you a sense of the powerful effect that water would have had in the upper villages is to appreciate how long it took to go through the lower villages. The valley levels out into an alluvial plain, and those 600 million gallons of water took about an hour and a half to flow through and flood the town of Northampton and empty into the Connecticut River. In the upper villages, where the land is steeper, that amount of water went through Williamsburg, Skinnerville, and Haydenville in just 15 minutes each. 139 people were killed, almost 800 people were left homeless, and more than $1 million worth of damage was sustained. It was the worst industrial disaster in American history at the time. My book, American Phoenix, is about the only village that wasn't rebuilt, Skinnerville, and the man at the center of that village, William Skinner. And what sets Skinner's story apart is the success he achieved after this horrific event. Skinnerville suffered the worst destruction of all. Some said that it was obliterated from the face of the earth. There wasn't a brick left of Skinner's mill. His house was very nearly the only one left standing. And he lost more financially than any other individual in the valley. In those 15 minutes, he lost the equivalent today of $35 million. He was ruined, but he managed to come back, unlike the others. The other manufacturers who lost their mills and property in this disaster, in their efforts to rebuild, they either went out of business, they went into bankruptcy, they had to sell their businesses, they had to leave town. A local historian said just a few years later, men of abundant means who seemed to withstand the first shock of disaster proved to be more embarrassed than was expected. But Skinner, because he was willing to make choices that no one else was willing to make in an effort to survive, not only reestablished his business, but carried it on as a sole proprietor and rebuilt it into one of the largest silk companies in the world. When he died in 1902, he was a multimillionaire. They said he owned the largest silk mill in this country, and he was at the top of the healthiest silk trade in the world, the American silk trade. His comeback after the disaster was called one of the greatest in the annals of American industry. Oh. Is that one of the windows you were talking about that comes up? I am completely illiterate when it comes to a PC. This is a map of Williamsburg from 1873. And this little kidney-shaped thing up here, it also looks like an elf's hat, was the reservoir. Here's the village of Williamsburg, Skinnerville, and Haydenville. This is a stereo view of the dam after it gave way. The dam was between 500 and 600 feet across, or almost the length of 2 football fields. This is a graphic illustration showing the water surging past Skinner's house in Skinnerville. As you can see, the water is almost up to the 2nd story. They said the house survived the flood because its 5 chimneys rooted it to the ground. It acted like a dam in the midst of the surge, with the water backing up against it and then rushing around the sides. So the front piazza was half torn off, the back of the building was crushed, 1st floor windows were broken, the entire downstairs was flooded, several feet deep with mud and water. The library floor collapsed under the weight of all the slurry, and so they said the effect was a whirlpool that drew all the furniture down into the cellar, with the piano landing on top. This house Skinner took apart and moved with him when he left the valley. I'll get to why he left the valley in a minute, but he moved to Holyoke. And this house he had taken apart piece by piece. It was shipped on 25 railroad cars to Holyoke, where it was put back together. It was cheaper for him to move the house than to rebuild it, or to build a new one. The house stands today as a museum. It's in Holyoke, Massachusetts, and you can go and visit this house that survived the flood and was moved 20 miles thereafter. This is an image of the village of Skinnerville, what little remained after the flood. Here's Skinner's house, with the piazza half torn off. This is all that remained of the silk mill, which extended far to the left of this image. One of Skinner's employees would proudly report that a bucket was also found because there was so little remaining of the mill. This is what remains of the Hayden Gear and Company brass factory. It was in the neighboring village of Haydenville, and this is the image on the cover of my book because it best represents a sense of disaster. There was no image of Skinner's mill to use, so we had to find another comparable image, or an image not necessarily comparable, but that was useful. This mill was 600 feet long, the length of 2 football fields. This was all that was left of it. And this image was taken a while after the disaster because all of the debris has been cleared out of the building. This looks more like what a building would look like after a fire rather than a flood. A flood leaves a tremendous amount of debris. So this is after that building had been cleared of that debris. This is an image of Skinnerville. Another image from Skinnerville. This house was lived in by a family whose children, many of whom worked for Skinner, the Bartlett family. And this was all that was left of their property after the flood. They lived in this house through the summer in this condition. And then when Skinner ultimately left Skinnerville, they too left and they moved to Connecticut. Skinner's company lasted well into the 20th century. It lasted until 1961, in fact, 113 years after he founded it in 1848. Skinner's sons, Joe and Will, took over the company after he died, and they were a brilliant team. Joe handled the production and the technology development at the mill, while Will handled the sales and marketing. And they carried on their father's tradition of innovation and expansion within the context of the times. They also carried on his legacy of philanthropy. When Skinner moved to Holyoke, he felt it was his duty to give back to the city that had given him a second chance. And he founded the hospital there, the library, the YMCA. He gave to several institutions. And his children carried on this sense of giving back. Here in the Hudson River Valley, there is a Skinner Music Hall at Vassar College that is from the Skinner family. There is a Skinner Hall at Mount Holyoke College that's also from them. There's a Skinner State Park in Massachusetts with a Skinner Mountain. And of course, though, the greatest legacy of the family was the company. And as I mentioned, they were incredibly innovative. They're one of the first textile companies to branch out into consumer advertising. This is an ad from Good Housekeeping in 1907. Here's an ad from 1931 featuring Joan Crawford modeling a dress of Skinner's silks. And the man up top is Adrian. He was the head costume designer for MGM. And he put his name on this campaign. He dressed all of his stars, Joan Crawford, Betty Davis, and the like, in gowns of Skinner's silks and satin. And the advertising campaign reflected this fact that if you wore Skinner's silks, you too could be a star. Here's an ad from 1951 featuring what was arguably the most famous Skinner product, their bridal satin. And after World War II, returning soldiers were getting married by the thousands, and their brides made this satin extraordinarily popular, so much so that industry experts said that that made Skinner a household name in the United States. When Skinner died, Reader's Digest in the 1950s included Skinner on a list of one of the most influential Englishmen to land on American soil because of the breadth of his company in the 20th century. Here he is, around the age of 30, and he was my great-great-grandfather. It's two greats. He is seated here with his oldest daughters, Nina on the left and Nellie on the right. He has just opened his first silk mill in the area that would become known as Skinnerville. And his first wife, Nancy, has just died. He is a widower in this photograph. To me, this photo of him just burns with intensity. I'm still captivated by it, and I've seen it many, many times. This was his first wife, Nancy. He was very much in love with her and devastated by her premature death. On her gravestone, he had engraved a small verse that reads, "A shadow flits before me, not thou, but like to thee. Ah, Christ, that it were possible for one short hour to see the souls we loved, that they might tell us what and where they be." 2 years later, he married Sarah Elizabeth Allen. She was known as Lizzie, but her formal name was Sarah Skinner, and she is the woman after whom I'm named. My full name is Sarah Skinner Kilborne. And you would think I'm named after his wife. He was the founder of the family company. My grandfather was the last president of the company. That I would have grown up hearing about William Skinner. But I did not. He died in 1902, too long ago for modern memory, and I vaguely knew he was British, and that was about it. But I did grow up hearing about this woman, and she led me to her father's story. This is Belle Skinner. She was Skinner's second youngest daughter, and she was a famous philanthropist in France after World War I. What she did was legally adopt from the French government, it's a binding legal document, an entire village in the northeast of France. The government was going to abandon it. They considered it hopeless. But Belle took it on, she rebuilt it, and it exists to this day because of her. I was fascinated by her. And she was this larger-than-life character. She had thundering days, and she signed her letters with oceans of love. She hated grapefruit, she loved Great Danes, she called the president of France Ray Ray. His name was Poincaré. And she just was this phenomenal character, great hats. And so, I began to research her life story. I was fascinated. And I wondered, along the way, what would inspire this woman, then in her 50s, leading a very comfortable life, to become so passionately involved in the resurrection of a devastated village. Well, rewind. When she's 8 years old, the village into which she was born, Skinnerville, was destroyed in a flood and never rebuilt. I began to research the flood as an inroad into Belle's story, but the more I researched the flood, the more I couldn't stop. It was a significant event in our industrial history, and I was completely taken with it. And although nobody had told me about William Skinner growing up, he was a central figure in this disaster, and suddenly he began to come alive for me in the historical record. Every move he made was followed closely, because the decision whether he stayed or left the valley was considered paramount to its future. So suddenly, as I'm reading all these documents, I'm following every move he makes along the way. And I knew how his story ended. He became a success. And as I learned of his catastrophic losses during the disaster, I became all the more impressed with what he'd been able to achieve thereafter. His story is one of resiliency. Never give up. Obstacles are opportunities. For every problem, there is a creative solution. You just have to find it. Don't believe in luck. There is no such thing. You have to make your own luck. Work hard for what you want. Don't believe in failure. Believe in yourself. These were things this Skinner lived by. He was born in 1824 in East London, into a slum of such poverty that it was considered without parallel in the kingdom. He was born into a community of silk workers that had been making silk for generations. But they were so poor and malnourished, they were called a stunted, puny race. The average life expectancy was 16. An advocate for the welfare of these silk workers said, "It is not that some starve, but that so many are on the verge of starvation. It is not that a few suffer, but that so few escape." Well, Skinner did escape. He came to this country at the age of 20. He had nothing of any material value. He was so poor. And so the story goes, he threw most of what he owned overboard before arriving in New York Harbor. But he did have one thing of extreme value that was intangible. And it was something that no American had at the time. And that was a knowledge of how to dye silk. There was no silk industry in this country at that time. And it's hard for us to appreciate what silk meant to the culture. But before designers, fabric was fashion, and silk was supreme. Benjamin Franklin said, "Silk, it is the happiest of all inventions of clothing." And Skinner used to say that there is not an Irish servant girl who comes over to this country whose ambition is not to wear a silk dress. Silk symbolizes prosperity, prestige, a sense of royalty. Our country had no domestic industry manufacturing silk. It was a lacking. Skinner came over, he had one of the skills that helped establish the silk industry in this country. He became a leading founder of the silk industry in this country, and he parlayed his one skill into opportunity after opportunity, to the point where he had one of the largest silk mills in the state. This was the mill that he built in Skinnerville. And the mill was so prosperous that an entire village had grown up around it. This poor kid from East London had literally put his name on the map in America. Now, Skinnerville disappeared after the flood. So for the purposes of my book, I had to put it back together again. And through deeds and vital statistics and census records and probate documents, I was able to figure out who lived in which house, what constituted each of the families. Were the parents native born? Had they come over from a foreign country? Who was pregnant at the time of the flood? Who had given birth 2 days before the flood? Who had just moved to town? But there is only so much that public records can supply. And as so many of you can probably relate to, in any process, there are things that just happen that fall into your lap completely unexpectedly and for which you are forever grateful because they change the course of your research. So one day I received a call from the Wisteria-Hearst Museum, and that is the museum that is Skinner's home in Holyoke, Massachusetts. And they told me that a collection of letters had just been donated to the museum. It's a vast collection of letters written by some sisters who had worked in Skinner's mill in Skinnerville before the flood. It was a gold mine. Suddenly, I had a sense of what it was like to live in the village, what it was like to work for Skinner, what it was like to work in a silk mill, what it was like to live in a small factory community in the middle of the 19th century in New England. One thing that one must remember is that factory work at that time was very desirable for a young, ambitious woman. It was respectable and lucrative. You could have a sense of independence. You could make your own money. You could live away from home and not compromise your character. Lovicia Littlefield was the first sister to come work for Skinner. She arrived in 1866 at the age of 20. She became an expert spooler, which meant that she worked in the finishing department of the mill, winding the silk on the spools that would actually go to market. She was fantastic at that job. The next sister to come was a young woman named Frances. Frances was a terrible spooler, She didn't take to factory work, and she left shortly thereafter to take up housekeeping. Ellen was the third sister to come. She arrived in the fall of 1867. She was 25 years old. She'd been a school teacher, and the idea of working in a mill in a community of people, making a lot of money, was far more appealing than being stuck in the rural countryside in a schoolhouse all by yourself with a bunch of children. She was a packer in the mill, and she would take those finished spools that Lovaisi would make, she would pack them and send them to market. Ellen worked for Skinner the longest. Lovaisi left to get married and go on to that chapter in her life. Ellen was still working for Skinner at the time of the flood. She worked for him in the summer thereafter, helping him salvage silk, and she moved to Holyoke and worked in the new mill in Holyoke. She eventually married Skinner's bookkeeper, Nash Hubbard. Ellen has the strongest female voice in the book. She gives us a sense of what it was like to be a laborer both before, during, and after the flood. Now, the valley's loss was somebody else's potential gain. The industrial infrastructure of the valley was decimated after the disaster, and capitalists and investors converged on it, offering incentives to all the manufacturers that had lost their mills to relocate elsewhere. Offers came from as far away as Omaha, Nebraska. The most aggressive voice in this choir was that of Holyoke, Massachusetts. And Holyoke was a new and up-and-coming city, exquisitely designed for manufacture. It has a 3-tiered canal system so that the Connecticut River, which comes in on the right-hand side, the upper right-hand side, the Connecticut River can be used over 3 times to manufacture mills within this environment. It provides constant, reliable water power 365 days a year. Holyoke made offers to every manufacturer on the stream. Excellent offers. Skinner was the only one who accepted Holyoke's offer and ultimately moved. Now, the one-dimensional narrative is that Skinner loses everything in the flood, he leaves Skinnerville, he goes to Holyoke. It was much more complicated than that. There were several factors involved, but the 2 most critical ones were financing and water power. Skinner needed money if he was going to rebuild. And if he stayed in Skinnerville, he was the patriarch of that village. He would have had to have rebuilt not only his mill and his water privilege, but the entire village. He owned most of the property, he owned most of the houses in which his workers lived. He needed water power. To operate silk requires a lot of power in the dyeing process, a lot of water in the dyeing process. And once the Williamsburg Reservoir gave way and was no longer there, helping to supply more water into the river, Skinner was not going to be able to rely on a constant source of water power again if he stayed in Skinnerville. He was going to have to switch to steam, which was simply too expensive for him. Holyoke came in and said, "We will give you rent-free property along the canals for 6 years. We'll give you a lot worth $6,000 for free for 6 years. We will build you a new mill. You don't have to put a penny down. Just pay a 7% interest beginning in January of 1875 for the next 5 years. At the end of those 5 years, you can buy that original mill at its original cost. You can buy the lot at its original cost. And we'll give you an acre of land for free upon which to build a new house." So Skinner was virtually offered free land and a free mill in 5 years to get himself going again without having to worry about paying off any debt. It was a deal he felt he couldn't refuse, and he didn't, and he moved to Holyoke. 6 months to the day of the flood happened on May 16th, 1874. This is November 16th, 1874. He had a brand new mill up and running. He was the only manufacturer to have a rebuilt mill that quickly. Holyoke made even better offers to some of the other manufacturers, and they turned Holyoke down, and they went out of business. Eventually, this mill was expanded repeatedly and turned into this mill, which was the largest silk mill under one roof in the world. This is a photograph from 1912. But this was far ahead and completely unimaginable, both in scope and in the amount of fortitude that it would require to accomplish. In 1874, Skinner was in Skinnerville. He was the patriarch of a thriving factory village in New England. He had one of the largest silk mills in the state. He had 200 people in his community. He had a wife and 7 thriving children. He'd made it. He was as enviably situated, they said, as a man could be. And Skinner used to say, "What's the biggest room in the world?" The room for improvement. And in 1874, he was looking to improve his business. He was looking forward to the future. He was looking forward to what he still might achieve in Skinnerville. So I'm now going to read an excerpt, and then I'll take any questions if anybody has them. So, can you turn the lights up? On the evening of May 13th, 1874, a tall, robust Englishman walked through the door of Delmonico's restaurant in New York City. He was neatly dressed in a black suit with satin trim, bow tie, and embroidered waistcoat, the latter stretched impressively over his well-fed girth. While an attendant took his overcoat, he was greeted in the foyer by a host of familiar faces, and several hands reaching out to shake his, an American custom to which he was, by this time, accustomed. In that genteel environment, however, his Cockney accent soon rang out like a clarion call at dawn, and one would have been hard-pressed to find even a well-trained staffer who didn't raise a brow at the brashness of the tone. Everything about William Skinner stood out, even his head, since he didn't like hats and chose not to wear them, despite their currency on the street. Inside the restaurant, which was housed in the old Grinnell Mansion on 5th Avenue and 14th Street, Skinner joined about 70 gentlemen who were filing upstairs to a private banquet room. They hailed from a great many places, but they had one thing in common: silk. Here were the leading manufacturers of the American silk industry, along with several congressmen, some local politicians, and even a Japanese dignitary. Skinner wasn't the only Englishman among them, but at 49 he was one of the oldest, and he'd been specifically asked to give a toast this evening that would reflect on the past and honor the pioneers, like himself, who had turned American-made silk into an enviable addition to the marketplace. Skinner hadn't wanted to be part of the lineup. He'd wanted to sit back and relax without the thought of having a speech to make. But at least one of his colleagues had successfully talked him into it. If having grown up poor and uneducated, Skinner quietly harbored a sense of social inferiority, few could match his formidable knowledge of the silk industry or his astonishing success therein. Further, he had a flair for the dramatic, and for all his instinctive hesitation to get up before a group of people, he possessed a natural ability to hold an audience's attention. This, along with the fact that he tended to keep things short, made him a popular speaker. Nor would he let his peers down tonight. As Skinner climbed the carpeted stairs toward the appointed dining room, chatting with friends and colleagues, at least part of his speech was already written out and tucked away in one of his pockets. Anyone who read the papers, or who knew anything at all about New York life, knew that to lunch, dine, or sip at Delmonico's was the crowning ambition of those who aspired to notoriety. A presence in this establishment, the most luxurious restaurant that had ever existed in New York, suggested irrefutable success, socially and financially. Banqueting here conveyed to the press and the public that this group of ambitious silkmen had arrived. Their tireless, determined, and often brilliant endeavors had firmly established the silk industry in the United States, and at long last a national organization devoted to their cause. Tonight, these men were celebrating the 2nd anniversary of the Silk Association of America, and the exhilarating truth that the American silk industry is, indeed, a power in the land. Their private dining room had been festooned with flags representing all the great silk-producing nations of the world, with the U.S. flag and the flag of the Empire of Japan joined in symbolic solidarity at one end. Banners from every state in the Union were hanging throughout the room as well, reminding each manufacturer that he was indeed part of a union, an industry of thousands of which he was a vital member. At the center of it all floated a sea of colorful balloons above tables glistening with silver and crystal. Each balloon had been painstakingly tied with silk thread to the stem of a champagne glass and labeled with an industry trademark, advertising the breadth of American silk manufacture. Over here was Corticelli, over there Chinacci, in another direction was Uncle Monk, the name of Skinner's own mill. Later on, with the toasts underway, the balloons served yet another purpose. The very ceiling would appear to rise up as the men raised their glasses in unison, elevating the occasion still further. In keeping with the celebration, the menus had been printed on American silk, in purple, blue, and green with white fringe. Like miniature silk scarves, they were soft to the touch and elegant to the eye, their satin fabric casting off a rich luster under the glow of the chandeliers. On the front, they listed the exquisite bill of fare, devised by New York's most famous chef, Charles Ranhofer, but with everything written in French, as on any given night at the restaurant. All this, of course, was quite unintelligible to many of the gentlemen present. The backs of the menus, thankfully, featured more familiar English, since this was where the evening's toasts were listed. Down toward the middle was Skinner's speech. Our pioneers, cherishing the recollections of the past, we emulate their example. By the time he stood up to present, a great deal of reminiscing would have already taken place, but his words, the organizers hoped, would put a flourishing cap on the topic. This dinner, after all, was nothing if not a jubilant reminder to all the men gathered that they were not only benefactors of the past, but progenitors of the future. They, too, were making history. Two days later, Skinner was on a northbound train, heading up the Connecticut shoreline on his way home to Massachusetts. According to his regular schedule, he visited the city nearly every month. He was on the last possible train of the day, which left the Grand Central Depot at 3 p.m. and put him on target to reach Skinnerville at 9:05. There was no dining car on the train. That amenity was as yet very rare, and there would be no 20-minute meal stop at any station along the way. Unlike his glorious repast of 2 nights before, this evening's dinner would most likely be packed in a box or brown bag, just a few perfunctory victuals for a traveling businessman. As the train sped along past the white church spires of various New England greens, the afternoon sun began falling toward the west, and the temperature began dropping as well. The hill towns of western Massachusetts, of which Skinnerville was one, were known for their long winters, and the year 1874 had been no exception. It had snowed for days at the end of April, with heavy storms paralyzing the countryside, and there was still snow on the ground in patches. But for the moment, in that sun-streaked car, Skinner was miles from any lingering wintry weather. Outside, the sky was clear, the tracks were clear, and he was rapidly winding down one of the most rewarding business trips he'd ever had. Skinner had just been hailed as a pioneer in his field. His speech at the banquet had been so successful it was highlighted in the papers, and his industry was considered by some to be one of the most exciting in America. Furthermore, his store downtown was filled with activity. He'd just hired a new salesman, a strapping young man named Fred Warner, to help his manager, James Peck, and he was getting ready to expand his business again. Skinner wanted to branch out into the manufacture of organzine this year, a thread used to make ribbons, which were increasingly the rage. Skinner already had the requisite machinery on hand, had apparently erected an addition to his mill for the new department, and had even hired a local architect to design no fewer than 8 new tenements to accommodate the new employees he expected to hire. As much as business may have preoccupied his thoughts, though, he had something else on his mind this Friday, May 15, 1874. His 18th wedding anniversary was this very day, and hidden, protected, in his valise or suit was surely a velvet-lined box from his favorite jeweler, Louis Tiffany, with something precious for his wife, Lizzie. Skinner, one of his granddaughters noted, loved giving things, and on a similar occasion, when he'd been unable to be home on the day of his anniversary, he'd returned with a diamond scarf pin, carefully selected and beautifully wrapped for the woman whom he called my darling. Skinner relied on his wife more than anyone. Every bit as intelligent as her husband, Lizzie was, in any conventional sense, much better educated, having attended both elementary and boarding schools and having herself worked as a teacher for many years. There seemed nothing this exceedingly capable woman couldn't do, from laying linoleum to explaining mathematics. Following the birth of their fourth child, she even helped handle affairs at the mill while Skinner was away in England, and later she helped run the mill's boarding house. Like many rural housewives, she was intimately involved in her husband's business. But what set her apart was the fact that she was the wife of a rich manufacturer. There was no economic reason for her to be absorbing these kinds of responsibilities. She simply took them on, utilizing her amazing genius for organization and development. More than a wife to Skinner, Lizzie was a partner. Skinner's first wife had died young, leaving him a widower with two very small girls. But Lizzie had raised the children as her own and given birth to 8 more as well. Of these 10 children, 7 were still living, and adding to Skinner's sense of accomplishment, all were thriving. Nellie and Nina, 23 and 20, had grown into smart, educated young women under their stepmother's tutelage. Nellie had graduated from a boarding school in Connecticut, where she'd studied French with none other than Georges Clemenceau, who was on his way to becoming Prime Minister of France. Nina had gone a step further, entering college with both of her parents' resounding blessing. She was attending Vassar in Poughkeepsie, New York. Lizzie's eldest, Will, 17, was about to close out his high school years at the prestigious Williston Seminary in nearby East Hampton, Massachusetts. Graduation was just a few weeks away. That is, if he could make it without being expelled. Will was charming, handsome, and much to his parents' dismay, completely ambivalent about his education. Also enrolled in boarding school was Libby, 14, who was attending the Grove Hall School for Girls in New Haven, Connecticut, but her school year had just ended, and she was back home again. Joe, 11, and Belle, 8, were each eager for summer break. Getting ready for the summer games, Joe had bought a baseball bat the previous weekend, and the very youngest, Catherine, only 6 months old, had recently made her first appearance in public, with the world delighting in her just as much as she in it. Skinner's train pulled into New Haven shortly before 6 o'clock. Departing passengers gathered their hats and bags and filed past him out of the car, replaced by a throng of new faces coming aboard, each one looking for an available seat, preferably by the window if he or she wished to read in the last light of day. A couple of hours and a few stops later, the train pulled into Northampton, where Skinner made his way to the exit and down the steps to the platform. Here, he transferred to a little one-car special hauled by a dinky locomotive that took him the last leg of his journey up the branch railroad of the Mill River Valley. The train passed the villages of Florence, Leeds, and Haydenville, the last aglow from gas lights that lined its streets, and then, at last, Skinnerville came into view. There were some lights on across the river, as well as several windows softly illumined in the houses down by the road. The mill, however, was but a large shadow in the distance, nearly indistinguishable from the general darkness. The school and general store, too, were no more than ink spots, for it was pitch black outside, owing to a new moon. Even in the dark, though, Skinner's own home, a 3-story mansion set back from the rest, with tall French windows stretching from front to back, was quite identifiable, with several of its many rooms lit up in preparation for his arrival. Through the air came the sound of his mill's bell, tolling 9 o'clock. At this moment, Skinner didn't know who would still be up when he walked in the door. The baby usually went to bed at 7:30, and then the younger children around 8:30. But there was always a possibility that Belle and Joe might try to keep their eyes open to welcome Father home, and since Libby had just returned from school, there was a good chance she'd have some callers this evening. As the train slowed in its approach to the depot at the northern end of Skinnerville, one of Skinner's employees, John Ellsworth perhaps, awaited him on the platform. The depot was about a quarter mile from the house along a dark, unlit road.
Thus, when Skinner stepped down from the car and into the cold night air, he would have found both driver and horse all ready for the short jog home. The trip and this day were almost over, the anniversaries behind him, and a new year in the life of his marriage, his family, and his work was about to begin on the morrow. He was 49 years old, and the fabric of his existence had never been stronger. As he walked up the steps to his front door, there in the middle of Skinnerville, with the river flowing reliably behind him, the mill at rest across the way, the houses of his neighbors and employees all around, and a reunion with his wife and children just seconds ahead, there wasn't one clue, nor any sign, that the very next morning, nearly everything in his world would be swept away. Thank you. Anybody have any questions? Quiet group.
The photograph you showed of the dam
Yes.
was where the higher level of the ground, is that where the original dam had gone up to, and the water level was up that high, so that the picture you showed the crumbled stone wall and some water passing through.
Oh, actually, maybe I can go. Can I go forward? The dam was an earthen dam, and so I'm not sure if I'm understanding your question correctly. What was your question?
After the collapse,
Yes.
that water level was down near the bottom of the picture.
Yes.
There were these big walls up.
The water
level was way up there?
Yes. Yes.
How hard is it for you to find to research, or how did you go about
Thank you. So the question is, how did I go about reconstructing this event since it was so far in the past? Newspapers were a great place to start. It was such a national news story that it was covered in every major paper in the country. News of it even spread across the Atlantic to England, and it was reported on the London papers. So I spent countless hours losing vitamin D in the bowels of the New York Public Library at microfilm machines, reading all of these old newspapers and putting them together. And a few of you have been to my house and seen my binders of research with all of the photocopies of these newspapers. Those were the place to start, for sure. And then it was hunting down whatever personal documentation I could find, calling people up, people who lived in the area in Williamsburg and Haydenville and Leeds and Florence, getting in touch with the local historical societies and finding out what diaries, what letters was, existed from that time period, and delving into those to then lead on to other things.
This is probably important. How did the U.S. survive?
Right. Thanks, Elwood. So the question is, how did Skinner's family survive the flood? How did people in Skinnerville survive the flood? Well, the gatekeeper of the dam was having breakfast when his father told him, "George, look there." His father had seen a portion of the dam give way. George immediately ran out to it. He raised the valve at the bottom of the dam to open up the pipe to release some pressure that was building up behind it. He saw that rivulets of water were already beginning to poke through the dam all across its face. He jumped onto the only horse he owned, which was a workhorse. It had never been ridden before. He did not own a saddle. He was so poor. He jumped onto the horse bareback. He rode it 3 miles down to the nearest village, which was Williamsburg, and he knocked on the door of his boss, the general manager of the dam, Onslow Spellman. Spellman didn't believe Cheney. He thought he was a small-minded farmer who didn't know what he was talking about, and said, "Well, Cheney, if you really believe what you say, you ride your own horse down the valley and warn the people below that the dam is giving way." And George said, "Look at my horse. It's frothing at the mouth. It's never run this far in its entire life. I can't go any further." Well, Cheney went to the livery stable around the corner and had a dickens of a time convincing the livery keeper to loan him a good quality horse. But at the same time that this was happening, a dairy farmer, to answer your question, Collins Graves, comes into town. And Graves sees the harried look of the gatekeeper. And what is the gatekeeper doing in the middle of the village at this hour of the morning? And sees the condition of Cheney's horse. And Graves says, well, if this is really true, I'll go down the valley and I'll warn the folks below. Now, nobody had any sense of how fast the water was approaching. They thought it might be there by noon. This was a little before 8 o'clock in the morning. In fact, it was less than 10 minutes away. And Graves took his buggy with the milk cans still in it, he hadn't delivered them yet, and he rode down the valley to the next village, Skinnerville. And he made it a point to ride as close to the mills as possible. He rode past the southernmost mill in Williamsburg, and then he rode past the Skinner's Silk Mill in Skinnerville, because those people inside would have had the hardest time hearing him shout because of all the machinery that was going on in the mill. This was a work day, everybody was already at work. So Graves rides into the village of Skinnerville and begins to sound the alarm. At the same time, there was an orphan who worked in Skinner's mill. She was on the top floor. She looked out in the distance and she saw a black mass to the north. And having seen the dairy farmer a mile from his normal route in the village shouting about the reservoir giving away, looking up to the distance, seeing the black mass in the distance, she started ringing the bell at the mill to warn people to evacuate. People started shouting, run to the hills, run to the hills, run to the hills. And they literally had minutes to escape. When Graves arrived in Skinnerville, he was about 5 minutes ahead of the water. And Skinner had heard the mill's bell. And he was sitting at breakfast at that time in his house. And his first thought was fire. There's a fire at the mill. Otherwise, why would the mill's bell be ringing? And he ran out to the front porch. He saw the dairy farmer, heard the dairy farmer's warning, saw that same black mass up in the distance. And the reason why it looked black was because the water had been acting like a plow, pushing the entire countryside ahead of it. So it wasn't clear water, it was black water filled with silt and all kinds of matter from the countryside. And people looked up in the distance, and some people thought that the village of Williamsburg was on fire. They thought it was smoke in the sky. But in fact, that was the spray from the waves shooting up to the heavens. And so Skinner ran down the street towards the mill, shouting at his operatives to run to the hills, run to the hills, run to the hills. And then once the mill was evacuated, he went back up to his house, ran through the house, told the family, get out the back, get out the back, get out the back. And they reached the railroad embankment literally within seconds. When Skinner turned around, the entire village was underwater. The wave had come in. And Skinner said to him, his experience at that moment was as though he was standing on the deck of a ship in a violent storm. Thanks, Steve. So the question is, what sort of mechanisms were in place to help an entrepreneur get going? And there was no insurance. They had fire insurance, but no one had flood insurance. And even today, it's really hard to get flood insurance and very expensive to have it. There was no government assistance of any kind. And so Skinner was entirely relying on whatever financial incentive could be presented to him to start over. And he also was a foreigner, so in terms of getting started, again, he wasn't local. And, when he started out in business, it's such a community-based environment that banks lent to native-borns first, and then to foreigners and immigrants second. After the flood, Skinner was in a tremendous amount of debt. and he did have to find whoever would give him the money to start over. Nobody in the valley provided him with any financial incentive to stay in the valley, although they all wanted him to stay because it was good for them and their future. But Holyoke was the only one that came forward and said, we will do this for you. Now, the silk business was also a business that was run almost entirely on credit. So Skinner didn't have to pay for the raw silk that he needed. He didn't have to pay for his machinery. All these things were able to be purchased on credit. So again, he was able to start out without a great deal of cash on hand. But of course that meant that he was going into a tremendous amount of debt at the same time. And at this moment, the country was in a national depression. It was the worst economic environment in a decade. So it was a very risky time to start over, under these conditions certainly, and therefore one had to find the recipe for success. Where were you guaranteed an opportunity to go forward?
Here, I just want to say that your style is a training. Sitting on 10 of this. So I know that you're looking at the page turner for me.
Thanks, Isabel.
But I just want to ask you.
He never went to Japan, but his son Will did. They did go to Japan. And Skinner was one of the first American silk manufacturers who was willing to take a chance on Japanese raw silk. Most of the raw silk originally came from China, and Japan didn't have a very good reputation because they adulterated their raw silk. And so there was a famous story of a young Japanese salesman that came into Skinner's store in New York City trying to sell him silk, and Skinner said, "Come here." And he showed him to the back, and he pointed to a bundle of silk that was completely useless and said, "I have no use for this, get out." Well, that Japanese salesman knew that in order to sell to American silk manufacturers, he had to provide them with unadulterated raw silk. And he became one of the biggest proponents for selling Japanese raw silk in America, and they began a lifelong friendship between a lifelong friendship between the Skinner Company and this Japanese importer.
The whole thing started with that.
Yes.
And so, is there another story, another book here that you had to put aside that now you're going to look up? Or is she
Ding, 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 ding,
confident?
ding, 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 ding. Yes. Good observation. Yes. Oh, you, Sandra.
Maybe a challenging question, not sure. I'm curious about him coming from London, a very poor background, and then being the boss of so many workers.
Mhm.
In the end, it looked like that, but thousands.
Yes. Yeah, he had over 1,000 employees at his death.
At a time where there were strikes and unions starting,
Mm-hmm.
what was his relationship with it? Was there a relationship? The unions even allowed, to know anything about how they, because of his background, maybe he was different, but what was that like?
That's a great question. So the question is, did Skinner have a relationship with the unions within his operation? No. There was a very famous strike in his mill in 1888 where the weavers struck because they were being mistreated, they felt, by one of the foremen. And they went to Skinner and they demanded that the foreman be fired. Skinner chose to fire the weavers, not all of them, but those that protested, as opposed to firing the foreman. Because in Skinner's philosophy, he wasn't going to be told how to run his business. It wasn't a popular decision, and he ran for Senate the following year, or shortly thereafter, and lost because of his handling of the strike. The Knights of Labor rose up against him and made sure that all of the tailors and whatnot in New York City boycotted Skinner's silks and did not use them. Skinner, because he could not sell his products in New York City, became all the more creative. He sent his son, and therefore he couldn't manufacture his silks either because the weavers were on strike. So he sent his sons to Europe, and they purchased silk that he then brought to the United States, and he began selling this silk in lieu of selling his own silk until he could get the mill going again. The unions were not popular among the workers even in the 20th century. They did not want to have unions within the mill. During the early 20th century, it was still a very patriarchally run operation, and the sons carried it on like the father had. So although there were these, very tense and bad times like the strike of 1888 or 1886. I think the strike was in 1886 and Skinner ran for Senate in 1888. In the early 20th century, the unions didn't come into the mill until the 1930s. And one of the workers said, that they didn't want them in the mill because it would affect the way that the Skinners ran the company. And not all the employees felt this way, but there were those that did feel that way. So, no, Skinner did not embrace unions at all. In the 30s, the company did have unions, or had to by that time. Yes?
By the end of the 19th century, there was a raw silk industry in the United States. It was a sort of cottage industry that was. It's commemorated in the Greenfield Village in Dearborn, Michigan, where there is a small place where luxury mulberry
Uh-huh.
is.
That's remarkable. The art of growing silk is called sericulture, and Americans tried to grow silk for centuries. The 17th and 18th centuries tried to grow silk. Early 19th century tried to grow silk. It's a very complicated and difficult art, and was completely unsuccessful stateside. And so manufacturers realized that it was cheaper to import the raw silk from the Chinese, who had been making raw silk for generations and were masters at it, rather than try to train Americans who didn't know what they were doing to raise silk that would be useful in a mill. But that's interesting. So Greenfield is a place in Greenfield, Michigan that...
No, it's in Dearborn, Michigan.
Dearborn, Michigan.
So Henry Ford built a thing called Greenfield Village to commemorate all of the kinds of manufacturing and things that he knew about in his youth.
Oh, gotcha.
And that was one of them.
Mm-hmm.
You're right, it's a very specialized skill. I happen to work not in silk place, but I knew
Oh, wow.
this was particular.
Mm-hmm.
They make silk thread.
Well, this is an ad from the company from 1945, and Maggie made this poster. Remember, the audience made this poster, which I think is gorgeous. These are some satin slippers from circa 1920s, made with Skinner's satin. And here's a silk cocoon. And it takes 2,000 to 3,000 cocoons to make 1 pound of silk. I have no idea how many cocoons went into this dress. Excuse me? No, my dress is not old. It's 21st century.
And what size are the shorts?
You might be able to wear them, Elaine.
I got my island girl.
So you should get Maggie to do your book covers.
No.
Based on the book.
Yeah. Well, yes, this is the book cover down here, but this is, I know that I love that art. I think it's fabulous. Yes, the colors are great. One more question? Hi, Eric.
A year ago, we heard a lot about floods. What do you know about
That's a great question. So the question is, what was the ecological impact of the flood on the Mill River Valley? And I don't actually know the answer to that question. But I do know that the farms did come back, and for the water picked up the components of these upper villages, Williamsburg, Skinnerville, Haydenville, and dumped it all in what was called the Florence Meadows. And one of Skinner's former in-laws had farmland there, which was completely useless for a period of time because it was so covered in all this debris. But the valley did come back agriculturally. So, I mean, that wasn't decimated. So if I'm understanding correctly, the question is, did I approach writing the book from a perspective, from a 19th century perspective, or from my modern day perspective? Okay. From my modern day perspective. There are a few words in there that are a little quaint, you might say, sort of dated. And I kept them in there because in the course of the narrative, it just seemed to add a sense of place in the 19th century. But I didn't write it with any conscious intent to write in the voice of the 19th century at all.
Cause the flood.
Yes. What caused the dam to give way was that it was poorly constructed. It was a shoddily built dam. And so many people were responsible for its failure, from the contractors to the surveyors to the owners to the county commissioners to the state of Massachusetts, that when the inquest happened to find out who might be tried as the guilty party for this disaster, everybody could point a finger at somebody else and nobody was held accountable. Like New Orleans. Yeah. Yes. How worms work. Okay. So that's a great question. How do silkworms work? Well, silkworms are the only domesticated insect. They've been so thoroughly domesticated that they can no longer survive on their own in the wild, and they have to be fed by humans. They feed on mulberry leaves, and the leaves have to be the exact right texture for the silkworm, otherwise the silkworm will die. And the silkworm, from the moment that it's hatched, it's teeny, teeny, tiny. It's about the size of a, what's it, like a little seed? No, smaller than a grain of rice. Poppy seed, thank you. And it grows in 6 weeks 10,000 times to the size of a sweet pickle. And it eats voraciously around the clock, these mulberry leaves. And then it spins its cocoon, which is silk. And one cocoon contains one strand of silk that's about half a mile long. Maybe one more and then we're all good. The Indian head. Skinner chose for his logo an Indian head. And it was a shrewd move at the time. He chose in the middle of the 19th century. And the Indian head at that time was on every penny. So it equated his product with a sense of worth that was potentially available to everyone. And the Indian head logo survived well into the 20th century. The image changed from a Plains Indian to, all kinds of different Indian heads came to represent the company, but that's what it was. And the irony is that when the family sold the company in 1961, the company that bought Skinner Silk was actually called the Indian Head Mills. So thank you so much, everyone. Yeah, he did have gout. Yeah. Thank you so much.